They said she was invisible, just another woman in a janitor's uniform, pushing a cart through marble hallways no one cared to notice. Yet, in the highest tower of New York, the new CEO began to suspect that this single mother was not who she seemed. Why was she entering restricted labs after midnight? Why did security cameras capture her near executive computers, slipping something into her pocket before vanishing into the night? A mother struggling on minimum wage, yet carrying secrets powerful enough to shake an empire. What Richard Hale discovered when he chose to follow her would force him to question loyalty, success, and even his own cold heart. Would you have fired her on the spot? Or would you have done what he did? Follow her into the shadows to uncover the truth. Stay with me until the end and tell me in the comments what you would have chosen. And if you believe stories like this should never be forgotten, like this video, share it, and subscribe. That's how these voices are heard. The whispers had been growing for weeks, and Richard Hale could no longer ignore them. At 40, he had risen to the top with a reputation for ruthless precision, a man who never missed a detail. Yet every new report returned to the same unlikely name, Alicia Brown, the night janitor. 32, striking even in her faded uniform, a woman who kept her head down and worked the loneliest hours. To the executives, she was background noise, the faint sound of a mop bucket rolling past glass walls, but the cameras told another story. Richard studied the grainy footage in his office, Alicia entering the R&D wing at 11:37 p.m., long after her shift should have ended, fingers brushing across executive keyboards, pausing at screens filled with confidential numbers, then slipping a small object into her pocket. This was not the routine of a cleaner. This was the behavior of someone with intent. He summoned the head of security, voice clipped and cold. "What do we know about her?" A thin file was dropped on the desk. Minimum wage, perfect attendance, a single mother. Nothing to explain why she prowled the heart of his company at night. Richard's jaw tightened. A billion-dollar launch loomed in just 3 weeks. One leak could bury years of work, sink the trust of investors, and give his rivals the opening they craved. When the suggestion came to quietly terminate her, Richard shook his head. "Not yet," he said, eyes never leaving the frozen image of Alicia on the screen. "I want to know who she's working for. Tonight, I'll follow her myself." That night, as the city below flickered with neon and sirens, Alicia wheeled her cart to the service elevator. Richard, stripped of his tailored suit, waited in the shadows of the parking garage. Her battered sedan pulled out into the cold streets, and he slipped into his car, headlights off, 3 vehicles behind. With every turn away from wealth and deeper into the Bronx, his heart pounded louder. If she was selling secrets, she was about to make her move. What he didn't know was that this pursuit would not end in betrayal, but in a revelation that would unravel everything he thought he knew about power, loyalty, and the quiet woman who swept his halls.
The sedan rolled deeper into the Bronx, its taillights flickering against cracked asphalt and shuttered storefronts. Richard tightened his grip on the wheel, every instinct telling him this was the moment she would meet her contact. Alicia parked outside a weathered brick building, its faded sign barely visible beneath a broken streetlight. St. Mary's Community Resource Center. He killed his engine, waiting in the shadows, certain she would hand over stolen drives. Instead, he watched her open her trunk and pull out a battered backpack heavy with wires and laptops. With practiced ease, she pushed through the front door as if she belonged there. Curiosity dragged him from the car. From a cracked window, Richard caught sight of something that did not fit any suspicion he'd carried. Children, no older than teenagers, filed in from the cold, their coats too thin, their eyes wide with expectation. Alicia greeted each one by name, her voice warm in a way he had never heard in the sterile corridors of his tower. She unzipped the backpack, laying out refurbished laptops on a scarred wooden table, machines she must have carried piece by piece from the very building he owned. The kids crowded around, their faces glowing in the dim light. On the whiteboard, she began sketching lines and symbols, her hand moving with confidence that revealed far more than a mop bucket ever could. "Tonight, we're building something useful," she told them, her accent soft but firm. A boy raised his hand nervously. "Could this fix the center's old database?" Alicia smiled. "Exactly. That's the kind of thinking that changes things." They bent over their screens, tapping keys with a focus born not of obligation, but of hunger, for knowledge, for a future no one else was offering them. Richard's breath caught as he realized what he was seeing. She wasn't stealing. She was teaching. The object he'd seen her slip into her pocket on the cameras wasn't a corporate secret. It was a salvaged hard drive loaded with programs for these children. She moved from table to table, leaning close, guiding their hands across keyboards, whispering encouragement. A little girl beamed as the code finally ran, and Alicia laughed softly, the sound carrying through the cracked walls. Then came the youngest group, waiting patiently in the adjoining room. Alicia kneeled to their level, handing out laptops one by one, each loaded with simple software, each password their own birthday so they would never forget. "This is yours now," she told a boy clutching his new machine as if it were treasure. His small arms wrapped around it, tears in his eyes. In that instant, the suspicion that had fueled Richard's pursuit dissolved into something he hadn't felt in years: shame and awe. He stepped back, heart pounding, afraid of being seen, yet unable to leave. This woman he had nearly destroyed with a single order was quietly building a world no quarterly report could measure. For the first time, the ruthless CEO found himself uncertain, standing in the cold night, staring through dusty glass at a truth too powerful to deny.
The drive back to Manhattan felt longer than it should have, every red light stretching into silence that Richard couldn't shake. The image of Alicia's laughter among those children pressed against him harder than the city traffic. By the time he reached his penthouse, the skyline glittering outside his windows felt hollow. He poured himself a drink he didn't touch, instead pulling up her file again on his laptop. It was thin. Too thin. A woman with hands that steady on a keyboard didn't just appear out of nowhere. He called his assistant past midnight, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. "I want everything you can find on Alicia Brown. Work history, education, anything that isn't in this file." By noon the next day, a folder landed on his desk, heavier than expected. He opened it, and with each page, the ground shifted beneath him. Once, she had been more than a janitor. A graduate in computer science, top of her class, recruited into blue core systems right out of college. Within 5 years, she held patents with her name etched on them, designs that laid the foundation for software his own company would later acquire. Articles praised her as a rising star, a woman reshaping how systems could be built for speed and safety. And then, silence. A termination notice. A lawsuit. Words like wrongful dismissal and blacklisted. He leaned back, pulse thudding in his ears. The further he read, the darker it became. Alicia had raised alarms about a medical platform rushed to market with shortcuts that could put patients at risk. When she refused to sign off, she was forced out, branded a liability. Her testimony won her a modest settlement, but cost her everything else. Blacklisted from the industry, she worked odd jobs until the uniform of a night janitor became her last defense against homelessness. And then, a year later, her husband walked out, leaving her to raise their daughter alone. Richard closed the file and stared out the window.
He thought of her hands, the way she adjusted every loose cable in his building, the way she handled prototype devices with care most engineers lacked. She hadn't been sneaking into labs to steal. She had been salvaging forgotten machines to give life to children who had nothing. The suspicion he had carried for weeks now felt like an accusation shouted at a saint. That evening, he returned to the Bronx, this time walking straight through the community center doors. The air smelled of dust and chalk, the hum of old heaters filling the silence. A woman in her 60s looked up from behind a desk, startled to see a man in an immaculate suit standing there. "Can I help you?" she asked. He gave his name, and her eyes widened. "You're the one who runs Hale Dynamics?" He nodded once. "I'm not here as a CEO," he said quietly. "I'm here to understand what Alicia is really building." The woman smiled, leading him down a hallway where laughter and the tap of keyboards spilled from a small room. And there she was again, seated beside an elderly man, guiding his trembling fingers across the keys until his daughter's face appeared on the screen in a video call. 8 years apart, erased by a connection Alicia had made possible. Richard's chest tightened. He wasn't just looking at charity, he was looking at purpose. Something he hadn't seen in a very long time.
Richard lingered in the hallway long after the call ended, watching Alicia place a gentle hand on the old man's shoulder as he wiped his eyes. There was no audience, no applause, just quiet dignity in what she had given. When she finally stood, gathering the scattered notebooks and tangled chargers, Richard slipped back before she noticed him. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he wanted to be seen. The next morning, his assistant brought the final report: funding gaps, broken infrastructure, a waiting list of children desperate for space. Richard scanned the pages, his jaw tightening at every line. The company he ran spent millions on catered conferences, while this center struggled with duct-tape chairs and buckets catching rainwater. The contrast gnawed at him until he made a decision. That afternoon, in the quiet of his office, he authorized an anonymous donation, enough to repair the roof, replace the broken heaters, and fill the rooms with new machines. When the papers were signed, he told himself it was just practical, a way to learn more about Alicia. But when night fell and she unlocked the center, her gasp echoed down the hallway. New computers lined the tables, still wrapped in plastic. Children rushed in with wide eyes, touching the keyboards as if they might disappear. Alicia stood frozen, hand pressed to her mouth, whispering to the director, "Who would do this?" Richard wasn't there to answer. He stayed in his tower, staring at the city lights, wondering why the simple act of giving felt heavier than any corporate merger he had ever closed. Yet when he returned to work the next day, something had shifted. He found himself watching Alicia differently, not the way one watches an employee, but the way one tries to decipher a riddle. Late at night, while she polished the glass walls of his conference room, he noticed her reflection pause, eyes lingering on the projections glowing across the screen. Complex figures and charts that most would ignore, she studied them silently before moving on. When developers left code scattered across open monitors, she slowed just enough to read, her brow furrowing with recognition. And when a prototype tablet was left overheating on a desk, she quietly adjusted its position, saving it from ruin. Every detail added weight to the question he could no longer avoid. How much of his empire had been held together by a woman they all chose not to see?
3 nights later, the illusion of control shattered. The executive floor, normally a cathedral of glass and polished steel, throbbed with panic. A bug buried deep inside Hale Dynamics' flagship system had surfaced during final testing, corrupting data at scale. The launch was 3 days away.
Every failed attempt to patch it only spawned fresh errors. Arguments ricocheted across the boardroom like stray bullets. One engineer swore it was a server integration issue. Another blamed a corrupted update. Voices rose. Confidence collapsed. Millions of dollars and the credibility of the entire company teetered on the edge of ruin. Richard sat at the head of the table, mask of composure cracking beneath the weight of fear. His executives hurled solutions that demanded weeks, not hours. Investors were already circling, their faith brittle. He rubbed his temples, scanning faces that had once seemed invincible, and found only dread staring back. Then, through the glass wall, he saw her, Alicia, pushing her cart silently past the storm, eyes flicking toward the commotion, brow tightening ever so slightly. Something in her look, a recognition, a calculation, ignited his memory of the file, of the patents with her name etched in black ink. Without hesitation, Richard rose. The room stilled as he crossed to the door. "Alicia," he called. Every executive turned, confusion written on their faces. She froze, mop in hand, startled by the sudden attention. "Step inside," he said, voice low but steady. Murmurs rippled around the table. A janitor in the boardroom? Richard ignored them, sliding the diagnostic logs across the table. "You worked at Bluecore. You built the framework we bought. Tell me what you see." Her eyes darted from the screen to him, searching for mockery, but his expression held only urgency. Slowly she set the mop aside, pulling the laptop closer. Lines of code scrolled before her, and with every keystroke, her posture changed. The woman who emptied trash bins straightened into the engineer she once was. Fingers danced across keys, tracing logic others had missed. She muttered under her breath, "This isn't integration, it's memory allocation, nested loops triggering cascades under heavy load." A hush fell. The lead developer leaned forward, eyes wide. She pointed to a specific section. "This patch you've been using is masking the real failure. At scale, it collapses." Her voice, calm and precise, sliced through the chaos. Richard's pulse steadied for the first time in hours. Can it be fixed before launch? Alicia lifted her gaze, steady now, fire sparking behind her fatigue. "Yes, but I'll need full access." The CTO sputtered, "She's a janitor." "She's the only one who's seen the truth," Richard cut in. His command silenced the room. He extended his hand toward her, the authority of a CEO and the desperation of a man with nothing left to lose. "Then let's save this company together."
The moment her fingertips touched the company's mainframe, the room itself seemed to shift. Alicia no longer moved like a woman hiding in plain sight. She moved like someone who had once commanded respect, her focus razor-sharp. Screens filled with cascading code, red error lines flaring like alarm bells. She leaned in, muttering under her breath, rewriting functions, isolating loops, stripping away false patches layer by layer. The developers who had doubted her minutes ago now clustered behind her, watching as the janitor became the architect they'd never known existed. Richard stood at her shoulder, arms crossed, eyes unblinking. For the first time in his career, he surrendered control. Not to an executive, not to a board member, but to the woman who scrubbed his floors. And what she delivered was nothing short of miraculous. Hours bled into the night. Alicia refused breaks, her hands steady even as exhaustion carved shadows beneath her eyes. She guided the team with calm authority, explaining not with condescension, but with clarity, showing them how one faulty workaround had metastasized into disaster. One engineer whispered, "She's teaching us as she fixes it." By dawn, the impossible had become reality. The core stabilized. The memory leak that had haunted them collapsed under her solution. replaced with an efficiency no one had dared hope for. Test runs that once crashed after minutes now streamed flawlessly for hours. When the system hit full load, it held, stronger than it ever had before. Applause erupted in the war room, raw relief spilling into cheers. But Alicia only leaned back, exhaling, a quiet smile tugging her lips. "It'll hold," she said simply. Her certainty was enough to silence every doubt. 46 hours later, the launch went forward as scheduled. Investors called it a triumph. Headlines praised Hale Dynamics for engineering brilliance. The stock soared 12% in a single day. Cameras flashed, reporters clamored for quotes. But when Richard stood before his company, he knew the story couldn't be told without her. "All of you know Alicia Brown as the woman who keeps these halls clean," he began, voice carrying through the atrium where hundreds had gathered. Murmurs rippled. Alicia, still in her uniform, stood awkwardly at the back. Richard extended his hand. "What you don't know is that Alicia once built the foundation of what we all stand on. And when this company faced collapse, she was the one who saved it." Every head turned as she reluctantly stepped forward. Uneasy silence gave way to thunderous applause. And for the first time in years, Alicia lifted her chin, shoulders squared, no longer invisible. The applause still echoed in Alicia's ears as she stood beside Richard on the stage, the weight of 1,000 eyes pressing against her. For a heartbeat, she felt exposed, as if the uniform she wore had been stripped away to reveal the woman she once was, and the woman she had fought to bury. Richard leaned toward the microphone. "Effective immediately, Hale Dynamics offers Alicia Brown a place in our leadership team, where she belongs." Gasps rippled through the crowd, the murmur of disbelief colliding with cheers. But Alicia shook her head. "Mr. Hale," she said softly, the microphone catching every syllable, "I'm grateful, but I cannot accept." A hush fell, heavy enough to silence even the flashing cameras. Richard's jaw tensed. "Why?" he demanded, though his voice betrayed surprise more than anger. Alicia looked past him, to the employees still clapping, to the faces that had only ever known her as a shadow. "My daughter, my community," she said, voice steady now. "Those kids in the Bronx don't need another executive sitting in a tower. They need someone to show up, to give them tools no one else will. That's where I belong." Her words struck harder than any applause. A murmur swept the room again, this time not of disbelief, but of something closer to respect. Richard's face remained unreadable, but his eyes followed her as she stepped back from the podium, retreating into the sea of astonished employees. Later that evening, when the building emptied and silence reclaimed the halls, Richard found her gathering her things in the janitor's closet she had turned into a makeshift locker. "You just walked away from a position people spend their lives chasing," he said quietly. She met his gaze without flinching. "Some dreams aren't mine anymore." For the first time, Richard's cold mask cracked. "Then let me offer something else. Hale Dynamics will fund a technology access initiative, equipment, mentorships, internships, but it needs a director who understands the fight these kids face, someone they already trust." Alicia froze, her breath catching. "Are you serious?" Richard nodded, extending his hand, not as a CEO demanding obedience, but as a man recognizing another's strength. "It's yours if you want it." For the first time in years, a genuine smile broke across her face, lighting her features with something more powerful than triumph, hope. She placed her hand in his. Then let's build it together. In that moment, the woman once dismissed as invisible and the man who had built walls around his heart stood on the same ground, not as boss and employee, but as allies ready to rewrite what success truly meant.
The boardroom was colder than usual. A long mahogany table stretching like a battlefield between Richard and the directors who had once praised his every move. The quarterly review had barely begun when the CFO cleared his throat. "This Technology Access Initiative," he said, sliding papers across the table. "It's draining resources without measurable return. Philanthropy is admirable, but it does not pay dividends." A chorus of agreement followed. "Investors won't support a vanity project," another added. "We're here to maximize profit, not sponsor after-school clubs." Richard's jaw flexed, his silence heavier than their arguments. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice sharp as glass. "You call it a vanity project. I call it insurance against blindness. Do you know who kept this company from collapsing last week? The woman you all stepped over in the hallway. The janitor you never once looked at." His hand struck the table with a force that silenced them. The directors shifted uneasily, but one persisted. "Even so, Richard, pouring millions into children from the Bronx isn't a strategy, it's charity." Before Richard could answer, the doors opened. Alicia stood there, having come to return signed papers, unaware she was walking into war. She froze, but Richard gestured her closer. "Tell them." Her heart pounded, but she stepped to the table, facing men in suits who had dismissed her kind all her life. "You want numbers?" she began. "In the last month, 70 kids who would have been on the streets are building apps and writing resumes. 17 have qualified for internships, your future engineers. Do you measure that in quarterly profit or in a generation that might one day save your company again?" Silence. Even the CFO faltered under her gaze. Richard rose, his voice steady but burning. "We've already seen brand perception climb 30%. Investors are noticing. What they don't see, but what I do, is that this initiative is our future pipeline. You talk about return on investment? This is it." No one dared argue further. The motion passed, begrudgingly, the funding secured. As the directors filed out, Alicia lingered by the door, her shoulders trembling with adrenaline. "You didn't have to fight that hard," she said, when the room was finally empty. Richard turned toward her, eyes softer than she had ever seen. "Yes," he said quietly, "I did." For a long moment, neither moved. Then, almost shyly, Alicia smiled, an acknowledgement that the war was no longer hers alone.
6 months later, the Bronx air buzzed with a different kind of electricity. Where once the old community center sagged under peeling paint and broken heaters, a gleaming new wing now stood, the Brown Hale Technology Lab. Bright banners fluttered in the wind. Children in fresh shirts tugged at their parents' hands, and cameras from local stations lined the curb. For the first time in years, this forgotten corner of the city was a destination. Inside, rows of state-of-the-art computers hummed. Touchscreens lit up with student projects, websites for neighborhood shops, games coded by teenagers who once didn't know how to open a browser. On the walls, posters of young faces beamed under the words, "Built for Second Chances." Alicia moved through the crowd like a conductor, greeting every child by name,
her daughter Sophia clutching her hand proudly. Richard stood near the stage, watching with uncharacteristic stillness. He had faced investors, journalists, even rivals without a flicker of doubt. Yet here, surrounded by children cheering Alicia's name, he felt strangely humbled. When she stepped up to the microphone, the applause shook the walls. "When I first came here," Alicia began, her voice carrying clear and strong, "we had duct tape on the chairs and buckets catching rain, but we had something more powerful than money. We had hope. Today, thanks to support we never expected, that hope has grown into opportunity. These kids are not charity, they are the future." The crowd roared, parents nodding through tears. Richard's chest tightened as he realized she wasn't just talking about technology. She was talking about dignity. At the back of the room, a group of teenagers presented Alicia with a wooden plaque, hand-carved with careful letters, "For the woman who believed in us before anyone else did." Alicia pressed it to her heart, blinking hard, her composure cracking for the first time that day. Richard approached, microphone in hand. "This company measures success in profits and market share, but today, standing here, I see a truer measure. Success is building something that outlives us. Alicia reminded me of that." His voice faltered just enough to reveal sincerity. From the corner of his eye, he caught Sophia and his own son Nathan working side by side at a coding station, their laughter cutting through the noise like sunlight. And for the first time, Richard thought that maybe the empire he had built wasn't the legacy that mattered most.
As the applause from the ribbon-cutting faded, the evening air settled soft and golden around the new lab. Families lingered, reluctant to leave the glow of a place that finally felt like it belonged to them. Alicia stood by the doorway, still holding the handmade plaque, when Richard joined her. For once, the man who commanded boardrooms seemed content to stand in silence. He glanced at the wooden sign bolted above the entrance, "Built for second chances." "Fitting," he murmured. Alicia turned, her smile tired but luminous. "Second chances built this place," she replied. "Not mine alone, all of ours." The children spilled into the parking lot, Sophia tugging Nathan toward the benches, their laughter echoing against the brick walls. Richard followed her gaze to them, something unspoken passing between them. "Funny," he said. "I thought saving this company would be my proudest moment, but it's watching my son learn from your daughter that I'll remember." Alicia's eyes softened. "Sometimes the real victories don't show up on balance sheets." She tucked the plaque under her arm. "Sometimes they're standing right in front of us, asking for someone to believe in them." They walked together toward their cars, the sleek black sedan parked beside her aging Honda. For a moment, the contrast made them laugh. Two worlds that should never have collided, now side by side. Richard cleared his throat. The board approved 5 more centers in the next 2 years. All need someone to oversee it all. Alicia raised an eyebrow. "Are you offering me another promotion I'll have to turn down?" He shook his head, smiling for once without reservation. "I'm offering partnership. We can scale this together if you'll stay." Her silence lingered, but then she nodded slowly. "I'll stay, if we promise never to forget who this is really for." As they spoke, Sophia and Nathan ran back, breathless. "Can we have a coding sleepover this weekend?" Sophia asked. Richard looked at Alicia, and for the first time neither saw barriers, only possibility. They agreed, and as the children raced ahead, Richard and Alicia lingered at the entrance one last time. The sign above caught the fading light, the words glowing like a vow. He looked at her, voice lower now. "You taught me something I never expected to learn in this building." "And what's that?" she asked. "That success means nothing if it isn't shared." Alicia reached for his hand, her fingers steady. Together they stepped into the night, not as CEO and janitor, but as two people who had rebuilt more than a company. They had rebuilt trust, community, and themselves.